Hello, good evening and good day, everybody. Um, Welcome to the Indian Interest Podcast, and I hope you're all doing very well. Uh, First of all, I would like to thank all of you for helping us reach the 500,000 subscribers mark. We have reached the 500K, half million mark. So thank you very much for all of that. I'm very, very deeply, profoundly grateful to all of you. This has all happened because of you, because of your support. So thank you very much for it. I really appreciate it. Yes. And with that, before we get into the actual podcast, let's take a look at who all is there with us. I can see Rahul, Purna, Kishore, Sayan, Shashwat, Tejas, Subhash, Abhay, Mona Lisa, Jwalin, Azminor, Apratibhat, Apratihat, Marshan, Ayush, Vladimir, Adityanath, Dhairya, Argyadeep, Shivansh, Rahul, Purna, Joy, Shravani, Soni, Moinak, Pitambar A, Mahendra, Dungar Singh Chauhan, Brijesh, Typical Gamer, Priyanshi, Pranay, Pratik, ex KGB agent, Smart Money, Lol No, Sakol, Aditya, Chiching, MIIT, Harsh, Manaj, Pranav, Ayush, Facts, Motivation Story, Mohit, Yashas, Aditya, Kirti Bhushan, Devashish, Shruti, Om, Peshwa Bajirao, Rocky, Web Dev Bappa, Himanshu, Haripriya, Abhay, Anant, Harsh, Martian, Sarthak, Jay, Rahul, Melvin, Shrivatsan, Shantanu, Siddharth Singh, Mahida, Pitambar Gupta, Jay, Sangram, Sky K, Vladimir Adityanath, Azminor, and lots of other people. Good day, good evening, good to all of you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. So, like I was saying, thank you very much for helping us cross the 500,000 subscriber mark, the half million mark. I am extremely, very, very deeply, profoundly grateful to all of you. This has all happened because of you, and whatever I'm doing is for you. So, thank you so much. I am very grateful. And just to remind you all, this podcast is also available on Spotify, on Apple, on Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. As soon as the episode is over, the audio is uploaded, and in a few minutes, it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, other podcast platforms. The links are in the description in case you're looking for that. Yes. So, and all the previous episodes are also available. I've never spoken about this, but yeah, in case you did not know about this, that's the case. And also, on the occasion of reaching the half million subscriber mark, I have, in case you don't know, I have offered a huge discount on the history course. Yeah, the link is again in the description below. The discount is, the course is typically it costs 1499 rupees, but it's available right now for 499 only. So in case any of you wanted to acquire the course and you thought you found it expensive or whatever it is, then you can now avail of it. It's the discount is going to run until 12 p.m. tonight India time. Maybe I'll run it for another couple of hours extra just in case. Yeah, so do check it out in case you wish to. Right. So that's done. So now let's talk about what's happening in the world. So this is the Indian Interest Podcast in which we discuss world events, geopolitics, etc., from the Indian perspective. And you've seen what the title of this episode is: Ukraine winter is coming. You've seen the thumbnail, so I think it behooves me to speak about that first, that matter, right? So let's once again take a look at the map of Ukraine and let's understand what is happening in that place and why is it important. I'll speak about that too. I mean, the question some of you may have is, why do I keep on speaking about Ukraine and Russia and this conflict, right? Why is it important? So we will get to that. But first of all, let's talk about what is happening in this place. So this is a map that somebody sent me on Twitter. It's a very good map. I typically use the other interactive map, but this one is very nice. It shows you the political divisions. Yep. So let's recap what's happened thus far. February 24 this year, the so-called special operation started, the Russian special operation in Ukraine. Yes. It was announced by Vladimir Putin, and the Russian military entered the territory of Ukraine. In 2014, the region of Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, was already annexed by Russia in 2014. And now this special operation started in February this year. So on September 30 this year, I believe, at the end of September, Putin announced the annexation of four oblasts or provinces of Ukraine, which you can see in the eastern region here, which is Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These four eastern provinces of Ukraine, which are Russian majority. Russian speaking people are the majority in this region. So that's what happened at the end of September this year. Now, before that, the Russians withdrew from Kharkiv. You can see Kharkiv here, the purple, bluish region, Kharkiv. The Russians withdrew from Kharkiv around the 10th of September this year. And then at the end of September, they officially annexed those four provinces. So the Russian military was perceived to have suffered a setback in Kharkiv, and they withdrew from the region in September. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, around the 10th of November, after they announced the annexation of the four provinces, including Kherson, around the 10th of November, the Russians announced that they were withdrawing from the northern bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson province, and they were evacuating this region, including Kherson city, after which this province is named. So this involved the evacuation of approximately 30,000 Russian troops and more than 5,000 pieces of heavy military equipment. Yeah, so that's what they announced. And this when you saw that this in the news, and when you saw Western analysis of this in Western media reports, they said that this withdrawal, the Western analysts were all saying this withdrawal will take weeks and the Russians will suffer tremendous casualties. What actually happened is that they were able to withdraw all of this 30,000 troops and more than 5,000 pieces of heavy military equipment. The Russians withdrew that in 2 or 3 days instead of taking weeks. So clearly, this would have taken months of advanced planning. So it was not a withdrawal that was precipitated by military setbacks. It was a planned withdrawal. Over several weeks before the withdrawal was announced, the Russians had been evacuating Russian-speaking citizens from the north bank of the Dnieper River. So clearly the Russians were planning this. Now, when this evacuation was announced, I said that there were three possibilities of what could be happening. Possibility one was that NATO is winning and Russia is losing. And after the Russians withdraw from northern part of Kherson, the Ukrainian military will try to cross the river and try to take the southern part of Kherson and then move on Crimea. That's one possibility. The second possibility I said was that there were secret ceasefire negotiations happening, and maybe it would be announced after the G20 summit. And maybe the prerequisite for a ceasefire was that Russia would withdraw from this region of Kherson. Well, that again has not happened. The third possibility I said was that the Russians were springing a nasty trap for the NATO troops, which is the Ukrainian troops. So in this scenario, the Russians will withdraw. It will be a false withdrawal from Kherson city and northern Kherson. The Ukrainians will move in, and then the Russians will annihilate and obliterate them with heavy artillery and with missile strikes and all that. And the Ukrainians seem to have anticipated that, because they have not moved in large numbers into Kherson city. And just a few days ago, the Ukrainians announced that their troops were withdrawing from Kherson city. They were evacuating from Kherson city. So the West has been portraying this as a liberation of Kherson. And then why is it that the Ukrainians are now evacuating Kherson city? What happened? If they have liberated the city, why are they withdrawing? That's what has been announced in various news reports, right? So these are the three possibilities that I said could hold. NATO is winning, Russia is losing, or a future ceasefire is coming, or thirdly, there's a nasty trap that's being set for the NATO troops. That's what I had said at that time, about I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. Last week, I said that there could be a fourth possibility, that this is actually a tactical withdrawal by Moscow. It's a prelude to a massive winter offensive. So let's understand that we are still not in winter. We are still in autumn, in the fall season, right? So that's the fourth possibility I put forth. I think it was last week that I said this. Now let's understand why I said this. Why is this possibly a tactical Russian withdrawal as a prelude to a massive winter offensive in Ukraine? So right now, we are in autumn. This season The autumn season, the autumn months, and the spring months are called the Rasputitsa season. Rasputitsa in Russian. This is the mud season. In this season, in autumn and spring, which is October, November, in autumn up to mid December, and in spring it's February, March, and up to mid April. Yeah. So in these months, you have the so-called Rasputitsa season, the mud season. You have muddy road conditions because of rain, because of melting snow on unpaved roads, and for cross-country travel, which is off-road travel. You have rain, you have mud, you have melting snow, you have bog, you have impassable deep mud. Terrible conditions for cross country travel, off road travel, and traveling on unpaved roads. Yes. So, this has historically given Russia a defensive advantage in wartime. Historically, if you think about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, the French invasion of Russia in 1812, this mud season, the Rasputitsa season, gave the Russians a major advantage. It ended up being a disaster for Napoleon and the French. Right. Then, if you go back just about 80 or so years, you go back to 1941, Operation Barbarossa, launched by Adolf Hitler, the Nazi German invasion of Russia. It was launched in 1941, and it culminated in the Battle of Moscow in October 1941. It lasted up to January 1942. So this was a decisive battle which happened outside Moscow. And once again, you were in this Rasputitsa season, and it ended up being a complete disaster for Nazi Germany. It saved Moscow from Nazi capture. Yes. So this season has historically been greatly advantageous for Russia from a military perspective, from a defensive perspective. Now, the Russians invaded Ukraine this year in February in the Rasputitsa season, in those conditions. Yeah. It and as we saw, it slowed down the Russian advance in various parts of Ukraine. The Russian advance to Kiev was slowed down. In other parts of Ukraine also, it was slowed down. So why did the Russians do such a stupid thing, apparently? Well, maybe it was not a stupid thing. Maybe they had planned it accordingly. And obviously, this would also hinder the Ukrainian forces as well, right? So whatever the Russians did, obviously there was some kind of planning behind it. They are not stupid people. We have to understand that. Don't look at how the media portrays the Russian. They are not brainless idiots. Putin is not a madman. They are very rational actors. They know how to fight warfare. They have a lot of experience. So that's what happened. So they invaded Ukraine in February. During this season, it hindered them to a significant extent. Now, we are again in the Rasputitsa autumn season. And right now, what's happened thus far? The Russians thus far have refrained from waging what is called total war against Ukraine. The Russians have refused to commit even 5% of their air force in the Ukraine conflict. On the other hand, the NATO, which is the US, is continuously replenishing and resupplying and bolstering Ukraine's military capacities. This is a proxy war. So Russia and Ukraine thus far until now have been fighting very different conflicts. Ukraine has thrown unlimited resources into the war. It's an all-out war from the Ukrainian perspective. It's a total war. They have thrown unlimited men into the meat grinder of the war. And that's not been reported properly. On the other hand, the Russians have been constrained. They have been restricted. Their military operation has been constrained and restricted. Thus far, they have tried to minimize collateral damage. Yeah. So the Ukrainians are fighting on their own territory. The Russians are fighting on enemy territory. But now what is happening? What is happening now? Now things are changing. Let's take a look at what is happening. Yes. So right now, let me put some news reports on the screen. Let's do this. So this is a Reuters report. Yeah, what does it say? Russia's war on Ukraine, latest news. This is from November 24, just a couple of days ago. Much of Kiev is without power and water after deadly Russian strikes. Yeah. So the Russians are... so what's happening is that the Russians are launching massive infrastructure strikes on Ukraine. Yeah, there are power outages all over Ukraine. The Russians are launching missile strikes and other strikes at critical infrastructure assets of Ukraine, and they are essentially now finishing off the electrical g- grid of Ukraine. Let's take a look at this NASA image that has been shared by the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So, video time lapse shows Ukraine in darkness. This is a satellite image by NASA of the night sky of Ukraine and Europe at night. And if you see this, the Ukraine region looks just like the Black Sea region, almost completely dark. There are a few patches of light, but it's more or less dark. This is what the satellite images, the latest ones, are showing us. Let's take a look at this in more detail. Yes, let's take a look at this before and after. This image is from January 27, 2022, this year. And the later image is about 3 days ago. You can see the enormous difference in what's happening in Ukraine. And you can also see lights diminishing in Russia, east of Ukraine. But as you can see, Ukraine is almost completely in darkness. So that is what we are seeing right now. Yes, the Russians are launching massive infrastructure strikes, on Ukraine. What the other thing that's happened is that Ukraine's nuclear power plants have gone into emergency shutdown because they have been disconnected from the grid. They have been cut off from the grid. So the Ukrainian nuclear power plants that are of Soviet origin are now in emergency shutdown. There is darkness across Ukraine. The electrical infrastructure is being destroyed. The grid is being destroyed. Ukraine is going to be without electricity this winter. It's going to be terrible for the civilians, and that's the nature of war. War is terrible. The Ukrainians have been doing this in the Donetsk and Luhansk region since 2014. In case you don't know, so now the Russians are systematically dismantling Ukraine's power infrastructure. This is now the Russian version of total war. It is still restrained. They are not obliterating civilian sites. They are not doing what the Americans did in Baghdad and other places. They are doing this precise surgical, you could call it surgical strikes, pinpoint strikes on the Ukrainian electricity grid, the power infrastructure. Yes. So this, I believe, in the coming weeks, see, winter comes in around mid-December. So in the coming weeks, you could see a Russian version of total war. In what is total war? You use everything at your disposal. You throw everything into the war. Examples. You want to see examples? For instance, in the Second World War, the Americans did this firebombing of Tokyo. Over 100,000, over 1 lakh Japanese civilians died in the American firebombing of Tokyo. Another example is the firebombing of Dresden in Germany in 1945 by the US and the UK. So this was a massive set of airstrikes on the city of Dresden in 1945 from the air through by heavy bombardment by the Americans and the British. Officially, about 25,000 civilians died. Most likely, more than 100,000 civilians died. This was a horrific atrocity. Yeah. So that is total war. Another example of total war is the various in the couple of the two invasions of Iraq, the Gulf Wars. Yeah, Gulf War One, Gulf War Two, carpet bombing of Baghdad, and overall more than a million Iraqi civilians died. This is called total war. Russia thus far has been extremely restrained, but now you may see actual total war. Yeah. So winter is coming. Winter begins by mid-December, and by that time Ukraine will most likely be without electricity. Yes. And so the mud situation, the Rasputitsa season, will be over by mid-December. The ground will freeze properly. The deep mud, the deep bog will be gone. It will be totally frozen over. And that's when the Russian artillery, the Russian tanks and other things can then make their move. So it is likely, in my opinion, that by mid-December, latest by end of December, the Russians will launch a major military offensive, into Ukraine. Ukraine is a proxy war. The people who are fighting are Ukrainian civilians. The equipment they are using is Western equipment, NATO equipment that has been provided to them by the Americans and by various European nations that are part of Western Europe, part of NATO, and part of the EU. Yeah, but no NATO troops are officially on the ground and fighting the war against Russia. And NATO most likely cannot get involved because that will be a major escalation and that can have all kinds of repercussions. So it is for the Ukrainians to fight. The US and the West will give them an unlimited amounts of arms and ammunition, to a certain, not unlimited, but whatever they can. Yeah. And they will give them money and all that, but how long will that last? Yeah. So most likely this winter you will see a massive winter offensive. Obviously, I could be wrong, but let's see if I'm wrong. This is what my gut feeling tells me based on my understanding of warfare, based on my understanding of historical military campaigns. This is what makes sense from the logic of strategy. You see, Vladimir Putin right now is being perceived as having lost Kharkiv and having lost Kherson. Whether you like it or not, he is a dictator. He is essentially the Tsar of Russia. And in Russia, the dictator or the ruler cannot afford to be perceived as being weak. Yes. So most likely, very soon, next 3-4 weeks, by December end latest, you will see a massive Russian military offensive into Ukraine. And I believe this war will be fought to its conclusion. Yes. So the questions are, will NATO push for negotiations or ceasefire if this happens or when this happens? Yes. Will Russia accept any ceasefire? See, when do you ask for a ceasefire? When do you request the enemy for a ceasefire? You do that when you are in a disadvantageous position. The US has already been telling the Ukrainians to be prepared, or to be willing to go for negotiations and possible ceasefire and all that. So maybe they also can see this coming, perhaps. So maybe they will ask for a ceasefire. Will the Russians accept? Maybe not. Maybe we'll see. So will this war be fought to its conclusion? Will it be fought until the Russians achieve their objectives? What are the objectives that Vladimir Putin had spoken about? He said that he wants the complete denazification of Ukraine. Ukraine is is essentially a neo-Nazi state. We can see that all over the place. There's unlimited imagery of that among the Ukrainian military, images all over social media. They use Nazi insignia blatantly, openly, yeah, unashamedly. So Vladimir Putin said that he wants to denazify, the proper, complete denazification of Ukraine. He obviously wants regime change in Kiev. He will obviously partition Ukraine. Yes, that's what he wants. And he also wants the de-NATOization of Ukraine. No more NATO activity in Ukraine. No more US covert activity, overt or covert, in Ukraine. And essentially what the Russians want is that Ukraine needs to permanently cease to be a threat to Russia. These are the Russian objectives. Will this war be fought to its logical conclusion? Will the Russians achieve those objectives? Will they launch a major winter offensive? These are the questions that exist today. I believe it is quite likely that the Russians will launch a major winter offensive once the ground freezes over. So let's see whether that happens or not. Time will tell us, and we will keep an eye on the situation, right? So that is where we are vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. Now, something related to that. Let's talk about something that is related to that. So I think last week or so, I had spoken about this New York Times article. So this is a tweet by them. I'm not opening the article because it's behind a paywall and I'm not paying. I'm not a subscriber. So the New York Times says that Ukraine has become a testing ground for state-of-the-art weapons and information systems that Western political officials and military commanders predict could shape warfare for generations to come. So the Americans and the West are using Ukraine as a testing ground for untried and untested military technology and tactics and strategies, and weapons and information systems. Yeah, how nice. That's nice. What else do we have along these lines? So here is another news article. This is from Politico, which is a US publication. The EU officials accuse the United States of profiting from the Ukraine war. EU officials attack Joe Biden over sky-high gas prices, weapons sales, and trade as Russia's war threatens to destroy Western unity. Yeah. 9 months after invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is beginning to fracture the West. Top European officials are furious with Joe Biden's administration and now accuse the Americans of making a fortune from the war while EU countries suffer. If you look at it soberly, the country that is profiting the most from this war is the US, because they are selling more gas at higher prices to Europe, and because they are selling more weapons. These comments, explosive comments, backed in public and private by officials, diplomats, ministers, follow mounting anger in Europe over American subsidies that threaten to wreck the European industry. What subsidies? The Americans are subsidizing US agricultural production because Ukraine is now not able to provide the unlimited amount of wheat that it used to provide to Europe. Yeah. Ukraine was Europe's bread basket. Now that wheat is not it's very hard to come by. So the American government is subsidizing its agricultural economy, its farmers, to help them produce wheat, which they can now sell to Europe. They can make a profit of it, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there's the double hit in Europe of trade disruption from US subsidies and high energy prices. This risks turning public opinion against both the war effort and the transatlantic NATO alliance. America needs to realize that public opinion is shifting in many EU countries. Yeah. The EU's top diplomat Joseph Borrell, who had made some very annoying remarks a few weeks ago, he said that the Americans, our friends, take decisions that have an economic impact on us. Yeah, right. And the US has rejected Europe's complaints. The rise in gas prices is entirely caused by Putin. It has nothing to do with us. It is caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's energy war against Europe. I mean, the Nord Stream sabotage had nothing to do with the US, obviously, right? Yeah. Exports of liquefied natural gas (LNG) from the US to Europe have increased dramatically and enabled Europe to diversify away from Russia. That's what the US officials said. But yeah, at what cost? That's the question. The biggest point of tension in recent weeks has been Biden's green subsidies and taxes that Brussels say that will unfairly tilt trade away from the EU and threaten to destroy European industries. Despite all these objections, Washington has so far shown no sign of backing down. Then European economies are tipping into recession, inflation is skyrocketing, and a devastating squeeze on energy supplies is threatening blackouts and rationing across Europe this winter. So European countries are turning to gas from the US instead, but the price the Europeans pay to the US is almost 4 times as high as the same fuel costs in America. So the Americans, if they are selling a certain amount of gas to their citizens for $1, they are asking the Europeans to pay more than $4, almost $4 for the same amount of gas. Yeah. And then there's the likely surge in orders for US-made military kit as European armies are running short after sending weapons to Ukraine. So they are sending the European armies, the European nations are sending their weapons to Ukraine. What they are doing essentially is that they are sending their older weapons. They're kind of slightly obsolete weapons to Ukraine. That's what they're doing. That's what the Americans are doing. Now their supplies are running short. They're sending ammunition to Ukraine, shells and various kinds of ammunition. So they are running short of that. And they don't manufacture these things. Who manufactures this? The US military industrial complex manufactures this. So now they have to buy more weapons from the US. And as a result, the Americans profit. And yeah, so that's what's going on. The EU leaders tackled Biden over high gas prices at the G20 summit in Bali last week. And the American president, Mr. Biden, obviously, unsurprisingly, seemed unaware of the issue. He had no idea what was happening. So the Europeans are frustrated, and officials on both sides of the Atlantic recognize the risks that the increasingly toxic atmosphere will have for NATO. This bickering is exactly what Putin would wish for, EU and US diplomats agreed. So again, blame Putin for what's happening. And there's a whole lot more. You can go through the article. So essentially, the United States is making a merry fortune of this war in Ukraine. And the Europeans are paying the price. The European nations, the NATO nations, and the EU nations are paying the price. This is a tweet by Mr. Vikram Sood, the former head of India's research and analysis wing, the RANW, which is India's equivalent of the Israeli Mossad. Yes. And he says, why does this not surprise me? Wars in distant lands make for profit, especially in a post COVID economic slowdown. So, the war from the US perspective is happening in a different continent. It's happening far away from US territory. So, for them, it's just profit, profit, profit. And they have this massive military industrial complex, which, well, which they run and they profit from. So that is the situation. That is what we are seeing in the news reports and from experts. This is expert opinion on a whole. There's a whole spectrum of this. You can dig it, you can look at it yourself. There's a whole lot more. I'm just showing you some glimpses, some highlights of what's happening. So that is the situation in Ukraine. The Americans, the Europeans are deeply frustrated. The political atmosphere in the NATO alliance is becoming increasingly toxic. The Europeans are frustrated. The Americans are refusing to back down. Biden seems to be completely unaware of what's happening. The Americans are profiting. The Europeans are suffering. It's going to be a cold, deadly winter for Europe. The citizens, the innocent men, women, and children who have nothing to do with the war, they are the ones who will suffer the most. Yeah. And it is the US military industrial complex and the US as a nation that will profit from this war. War is extremely profitable when it's far away from you. Yeah. So that is the situation. That is the unfortunate situation right now. So there's a lot to learn from this. Yeah. So that's about that. That is about Ukraine. Now, some of you will have this question, especially those who are new to the channel. The channel is growing, lots of new subscribers. Thank you once again. Yeah. So many of you will have this question that why am I covering Russia regularly? Why so much Russia coverage? And some people, especially the Western commentators in the comments and all, they seem to feel that I am pro Russia. Even some of them even feel that I may be pro China and I'm anti West. So what is the deal, right? The thing is this. I am not pro Russia or pro China. I am pro India. I'm pro India. This is a program. This podcast is from the Indian perspective. Unfortunately, what we find is that there are lots of Indian so-called geopolitical commentators, some of whom I have the greatest respect for, but most of them are clueless and they are simply parroting propaganda that's coming from the West. They simply read or watch Western news reports and then they parrot the same sentiments and the same talking points and the same propaganda. You see this all across the Indian media channels. They report the Ukraine conflict from the Western perspective. There are certain news channels that are extremely popular nowadays, one or two of them, who actually send reporters on the ground where the conflict is happening, and all of the reporters were on the Ukrainian side. The conflict was happening on two sides in the four regions that the Russians have annexed now, and in Ukraine. So if you want to cover a conflict in a balanced way, you should have, let's say, two reporters embedded with the Russian troops and two reporters embedded with the Ukrainian troops, and then report from both sides. That's how you get a balanced perspective. But no, everything it was from the Ukrainian perspective. I am not taking names of any news channels because I don't want to get into any unnecessary controversies. But that is the kind of reportage and journalism you see from the Indian media. It's disappointing, to put it mildly. So my objective is to provide an Indian perspective from the perspective of the Indian national interest. I am not pro-Russia or pro-China. I am pro-India. I speak about what's best from India. I speak about it from the Indian national or civilizational interest perspective. And regular viewers of this channel will know that I am anti-colonialism, I am anti-oppression, anti-imperialism. I am anti-unipolarity or bipolarity. And I'm anti-monoculture, the imposition of a monoculture over the world. Yeah. Bipolarity is the good versus evil dichotomy, which is a very black and white and simplistic way of looking at the world. The world is not black and white. The world has shades of gray. And there is this concerted effort to impose either unipolarity on the world or bipolarity and a monoculture. Just one culture all over the world. All over the world, wherever you go, people will wear the same clothes. They will speak the same language. They will worship the same God. They will eat the same food. They will have the same thoughts. They'll be taught the same nonsense. That's the same thing all over the world. Imagine how dreary and dreadful and boring the world will become if you do, if this is what happens. And yet this is the objective. This is what you see all over the place. So I am pro multipolarity for now. I seek India's rise. I seek India's economic rise and military rise. Obviously, to if you have a large economy, you have to safeguard it. For that, you need a military. And I obviously seek India's cultural and civilizational rise. I have spoken about this so many times, hundreds of times. And obviously, we want India to rise independently. It should be a rise that is mediated from within India independently. It should not be a rise that is mediated from the outside, from the West and its proxies. I want India to regain its historical position as the preeminent economic and civilizational power in the world. And I want to help the viewers understand how this can be made to happen. And how do you understand this? By making sense of how the world really works. So I am pro India. Now, the question is, some people say that I echo Vladimir Putin. Do I echo Vladimir Putin? Do I repeat the same talking points in the propaganda, the supposed propaganda that he says? So let's take a look at whether I am somebody who echoes Vladimir Putin. Let's see. So this is an address that Vladimir Putin gave the signing of the treaties on accession of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and Zaporizhia and Kherson regions to Russia. This is the annexation address, the annexation speech given on September 30, 2022. So some people say that I echo Vladimir Putin. But if you look at this address, you will find that Vladimir Putin has echoed me. He has said things that I have been saying essentially forever. And he has said things that no world leader speaks about. For instance, old viewers, regular viewers of this channel will know that I have spoken multiple times on many occasions about the fact that Japan, Germany, and South Korea are not independent or free nations. They are under permanent US military occupation. How many geopolitical analysts do you see speaking about this? Everybody portrays Japan and Germany and South Korea as democratic, free, independent nations. These nations are neither democratic nor free nor independent. They are run as puppets by the US. These are US vassal states. The US occupies these nations militarily. Permanent military occupation. Even Italy is part of that. Even Italy is under the same situation. So let's look at what did Putin say. So Putin said the US left a deep scar in the memory of the people of Korea and Vietnam with their carpet bombings and use of napalm and chemical weapons. The US additionally continues to occupy Japan, the Republic of Korea, and other countries, which they cynically refer to as equals and allies. The whole world knows that the top officials in these countries are being spied upon, and that their offices and homes are bugged. It's a disgrace for those who do this, and those who, like slaves, silently and meekly swallow this arrogant behavior. No other world leader has said this. I have been saying this essentially forever. And now Vladimir Putin has said this. So I am not echoing Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin echoed me. One of the terms that I use regularly is the term vassal state. Now, this is not a fashionable term. Almost nobody uses this term. It's a term that is considered to be kind of outdated. It's a term that originates in the European feudal era, vassals and all that. And yet I use this. And now Vladimir Putin has used this. No other world leader speaks about this. Yeah. How many times has he used the word vassal? In certain countries, the ruling elites voluntarily agree to do this. They voluntarily agree to become vassals. They brazenly divide the world into their vassals and all the rest. Vassals. So Vladimir Putin understands. Now, so I'm not claiming that he watches my program. What I'm explaining is that Vladimir Putin understands history. And he understands that this supposedly obsolete and old-fashioned term is still relevant today. The world has not changed. Colonialism still exists. Imperialism still exists. It has simply taken new shapes and forms. And people now use a new kind of terminology for these things. But vassals still exist. and Vladimir Putin recognizes this. To genuinely understand geopolitics, you have to understand world history. You have to study world history deeply. If you don't understand world history, if you are not aware of world history, if you have never studied it in depth, you will never understand geopolitics. Vladimir Putin clearly has studied world history, right? What else? He speaks about colonialism, which I speak about. Western elites are presenting their neo-colonialistic plans with the same hypocrisy, claiming peaceful intentions, talking about deterrence and so on. Yeah, current neo-colonial model is ultimately doomed, anti-colonial movement and so on. Once again, Vladimir Putin is saying what I have been saying for the longest time, but it's the first time a major world leader has spoken about this. Yet, I have said so many times that we are currently living in the so-called rules-based world order, which is nothing but a neo-colonial system. Colonialism is very much alive under the garb of democracy and human rights and the slogans of freedom and democracy and all that nonsense. It all started with the Atlantic Charter. Google Atlantic Charter, and you will know the origin of this hypocrisy. Yeah, let's see what Putin has to say about democracy. The West does not have any moral right to weigh in or even utter a word about freedom and democracy. It does not and never did. Yeah, Western countries have been saying for centuries that they bring freedom and democracy to other nations. Nothing could be further from the truth. Instead of bringing freedom and democracy, they suppressed and exploited. And instead of giving freedom, they enslaved and oppressed. Right? The unipolar world is inherently anti democratic and unfree. It is false and hypocritical through and through. So once again, Vladimir Putin echoed what I said. I am not echoing Putin. He is echoing me. I have also spoken hundreds of times about the West's colonization of India and Africa and China, the systematic institutionalized slave trade that the West created, the horrific plunder and devastation of the entire world, how the West enriched itself, the Europeans enriched themselves at the expense of everybody else. I have spoken about the genocide of nearly 100 million Native Americans. How many world leaders have spoken about this? Let's take a look at what Vladimir Putin says. Let's search for the term India. It's worth reminding the West. This is what Putin says, that it began its colonial policy back in the Middle Ages, followed by the worldwide slave trade, the genocide of Indian tribes in America, the plunder of India and Africa, the wars of England and France against China. He missed the US, but the US was also involved, as a result of which it was forced to open its ports to the opium trade. I have spoken about the opium wars, haven't I? Right? What the West did was that they got entire nations hooked on drugs and purposefully exterminated entire ethnic groups for the sake of grabbing land and resources, hunting people like animals. This is contrary to human nature, truth, freedom, and justice. So, what I am saying is very, very simple. I have not been echoing Vladimir Putin. I have been saying this for a very long time. But in this one speech, this one address, Putin spoke about all the points that I have been historically speaking about. So that's the thing. Those who claim that I echo Vladimir Putin could not be further from the truth. In this address, he echoed me. It's the first time a world leader has spoken openly about these things. So that is what happened, right? So yeah, so that's about Vladimir Putin. That's about Russia. But the question is, once again, why do I keep on speaking about Russia, about the Ukraine conflict? To understand that, we have to understand which nations matter from the perspective of India. From the perspective of India's rise. India is now a rising power. India is now regarded, openly or not, as a great power in the world. The West will still not say this. They will not still not call India a great power. Their journalists won't say it, their leaders won't say it, but their strategists know it. India is now one of the 3 or 4 great powers in the world. India is not a superpower. India is far from being a superpower. There's only one superpower, which is the US. There is one near peer competitor for the US, China, which has a large economy and a large military. And then there are 3 or 4 great powers. One is Russia, one is India, and that's it. Iran is an aspiring great power. Turkey is an aspiring great power, right? So we have to understand which nations matter for India from the perspective of India's rise. How does a nation like India rise? What does a nation like India need to rise as a great power? Any nation, any great nation to rise as a great power needs agriculture, it needs materials and minerals, it needs energy, it needs manufacturing, it needs access to transportation systems and transportation infrastructure, it needs you know integration with finance and trade systems and agreements. Yeah, it needs access to trade routes all over the world, and it needs interoperability and integration with other nations. You need all of these things to rise as a great economy and a great power. And to rise, in any nation's rise, you are constrained by a number of things, including geography. Let's take a look at the map. Where's the map? Here's the map. Look at the geography of India and then ask yourself, what are the constraints? So, any nation which seeks to rise is constrained by its geography. India has a certain kind of geography. You cannot change the geography of India. You have a certain set of neighbors. You have a certain kind of terrain. You have these mountain systems like the Himalayas, right? And you have the great expanse of the Indian Ocean region. These are the This is the geography that India has been given. That's the geography that India has. You can't change this. So a nation, when it is rising or when it seeks to rise, is constrained by geography and by demography and also by history, the events of history. So we know what kind of history India has had in the past 1,000 years. That is going to impose certain kind of constraints on India. The Indian demography is going to impose certain kinds of constraints on India, and the geography will impose certain constraints on India. It will also help India in a variety of ways. So these factors are pros as well as cons. But you need agriculture, materials, energy, manufacturing, trade systems, transportation systems, infrastructure, finance and trade agreements, trade routes, integration with other nations, and the constraints of geography and history and demography, right? These are the constraints. So India needs to rise, and we have to understand which nations are important for India from the perspective of India's rise. So right now we have a global system, the so-called Western rules-based world order. Please understand this so-called rules-based liberal world order, democratic world order, it has been created by the West. Its objective is to enrich the West. It seeks to preserve and expand Western hegemony. It seeks to maintain a global hierarchy and pecking order, a global caste system that is dominated and ruled and dictated by the West. This is an imperial system. It is nothing else but that. That's what it is. And go back to the Atlantic Charter. Yeah, the West portrays itself as virtuous. It portrays itself as superior to the East. It says that Western values are universal values. Yeah, it says that it espouses and champions human rights and democracy. Under this so-called Western rules-based liberal democratic world order, the East will always be subservient. Now the West is declining. We can see some signs of that. It's happening. It's undeniable. So we are now witnessing an emerging multipolar world order. Obviously, the Chinese would want it to make it unipolar again and so on, but that's what we are witnessing. We are seeing the rise of China. We are seeing the rise of India. We are seeing the revival of Russia. We are also witnessing imperial ambitions, neo-imperial ambitions in Iran. We are also seeing that Turkey has imperial ambitions of its own. We are also witnessing the Saudis, who are now showing that they have some aspirations for freedom from Western, hegemony. You are seeing that. We are seeing signs of that. We are seeing the French having some freedom aspirations of their own. The French are under the boots of NATO. They would like to have a completely independent foreign policy. Look at the history of France of the past 1,000 years. Who has been France's primary enemy? It's been England. The French and the English-speaking people do not get along. Historically, it's simply not possible. 1,000-year history of bad blood between the French and the English speakers. So the French would like to be free of NATO. The French would like to be independent again. Right now, they're part of NATO. They have a semi-independent foreign policy. To some extent, they're independent, but to a large extent, they are still under the boot or the thumb of NATO. The French have freedom aspirations. The Saudis have freedom aspirations. The Israelis, who are an old culture. They also have freedom aspirations of their own. Yes. And then you have nations like Egypt, like Syria, like Iraq, in the entire Middle East region that would also like to free itself from Western hegemony. If you look at the history of the Middle East, after the Second World War until today, the Middle East has perpetually been in crisis. Why is it so? Or this entire Middle East crisis has been created by the West. I'm not going to go into the history. It's a very long and complex history. But the entire Middle East crisis, whichever crisis happens every year, is all fomented by the West. It's all orchestrated from the West. They want the Middle East to be perpetually destabilized so that they can exploit the resources. That's what's happening. So this is the situation in the world right now, and there are a number of nations that are important for India. China is important because it's now currently temporarily a neighboring country of India because it occupies Tibet. China has to be part of our calculations. On one hand, India would need China as a counterbalance to the US. On the other hand, China itself is a huge threat to India, and India can never trust China. Russia is one nation which does not have any kind of conflict with India. And it is not possible for Russia and India to have a conflict because there is no zone of contention. There is no zone where Russia and India have any competition or any adversarial relations. So because India and Russia are far apart, the borders are far apart, it is the possibility of India and Russia being in any kind of conflict is negligible or zero. So that's why, and Russia is rich in resources. It is the heartland, essentially, in Mackinder's theory. It contains almost 50% of the world's natural resources. It's extremely important, and that's why the US wants to destabilize and break up Russia. Yeah. So Russia is extremely important for India. It also has technology, and the Russians also need India as a counterbalance against the US and also against China. Yeah. So we are witnessing an emerging parallel world order, the BRICS plus world order. Lots of countries want to join BRICS. There are lots of problems within BRICS, essentially the India-China tensions. And the Chinese are the root cause of all of that. India hasn't created the problems, the Chinese have. So these are the nations that are extremely important for India. China is very important. Russia is very important. That's why I speak about these nations regularly. The US is very important. India needs the US as well as a counterbalance to China. We would like multipolarity. We don't want unipolarity or bipolarity. A multipolar world is good for everybody. It's good for the whole world. A hegemonic unipolar imperial system or bipolar system is not good for anybody. It creates huge problems. It puts the world on the brink of war every single day. Nuclear war, yeah, and so on. So we would like to see a unipolar world order, a world order in which a number of great powers exist and they all cooperate instead of fight. Yeah. So that's why China is important, Russia is important, Iran is important, France is important, Turkey is important, Israel is important, Egypt, Syria, all of these nations are important. That's why these are the nations that I regularly talk about. And right now, the major flashpoint in the world is Ukraine. That's why almost every episode we talk about this, and we're going to continue doing that. Yeah. So that, I hope, throws some light on the themes of the Indian Interest podcast and why the things I talk about are extremely important from the perspective of India. If you are a viewer from Australia or from France or from the US, you may have a different perspective, which is perfectly fine. Everybody has their own perspective, their own vantage point. The world is relativistic, even in geopolitics. So this is the Indian perspective. This is the Indian interest, right? All right. Let's talk about something else. What else is happening? There are certain interesting things that are happening in the world. Let's talk about Taiwan, shall we? What's happening in Taiwan? Taiwan is important. Okay. TSMC sends engineers to US plant as Arizona officials reportedly welcome a second fab. This is an innocuous headline. So why am I discussing this? Yeah. Okay, let's talk about this. What is TSMC? Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. This is the world's most valuable semiconductor company. It's one of the world's largest and most important semiconductor foundries. Yeah, its customers are the biggest customers in the world: Apple, AMD, MediaTek, Nvidia, and so on and so forth. That's just like three or four examples. It is the most important, the most valuable semiconductor company in the world. Yeah, it is based in Taiwan. Yes, and let's understand that Taiwan's key industry is the chip making industry, and TSMC is what it is. Yeah, and chip making is a vital component of the US military industrial complex. Chips are at the heart of everything. You have a cell phone, it has a chip. Without the chip, it doesn't work. Your cell phone is a computer. And without the chip at the heart of the computer, your cell phone doesn't work. It's not going to work. You have a laptop, you've got a tablet, you got a car, you got a fridge, you got anything, any electronic device, almost any electronic device. At the heart of these devices, you have chips. Chips are indispensable, and chips are indispensable in cutting edge military technology. Nowadays, you even have smart shells that have chips inside them, and those shells are guided by GPS, those artillery shells. And yeah, so you have chips in everything. You have chips in drones, you have chips in various vehicles, you have chips in ballistic missiles, you got chips everywhere. Without cutting edge uh, chip technology, the world would not work the way it works today. And it's extremely vital and important from a military perspective. So the chip making industry is a vital part of the US military industrial complex. Taiwan is essentially a US protectorate or US vassal, and it's this company TSMC serves the various major US uh, companies like Apple, AMD, and so on and so forth, Nvidia, and so on. So what's happening here? TSMC is sending engineers to the US, to an American US plant in Arizona. Yeah, top chip contractor TSMC sent 300 engineers and their families to the company's $12 billion plant in Arizona last week, as this plant prepares to become operational. Yeah. Uh, TSMC's presence is now being established in the US, and the company seeks to build a second plant in Arizona. The cost of building new fabs in the US would be 50% higher than in Taiwan, but that's not a barrier for the US. The US is perfectly happy with that. Yeah. So, what is happening here? Let's understand what's happening. Recently, I spoke about this a few weeks ago. The Americans have imposed sanctions on China. Yeah, they gave an ultimatum to all of their engineers, the US citizens who were working in China in the Chinese chip making industry: return to the US or lose your citizenship. So, and they have blocked exports of key components and so on and so forth to China, which is essentially going to cripple China's high end chip making industry. The Chinese will still be able to produce chips and so on, but the cutting edge, high end chip making is not going to happen. Is no longer going to be possible in China because of this trade embargo and these trade sanctions, which were announced very quietly. So that makes Taiwan even more valuable for China. As we know, the Chinese seek um, to reintegrate Taiwan with China. They view Taiwan as a renegade province. They say that Taiwan is an integral part of China, and they will reunify it, and they do not rule out the use of military force. So the Americans are now slowly setting in motion a process of relocating TSMC to the US. And what they are doing is that the Americans are relocating, airlifting the core, of TSMC to China. The most important human resource assets are being moved to the US. So in a few years, the Americans will be able to, manufacture chips, which was being outsourced to Taiwan. It will all be relocated to the US. So TSMC will essentially have multiple, possibly, plants in the US, and it will start manufacturing chips in the US. And once this happens, Taiwan is going to become expendable. Taiwan could become worthless in that case. So, in case the Chinese try to invade, the Taiwanese could destroy their TSMC plants, chip making industry, and the Chinese will have a hollow victory because the main prize will not be available because now it has all been relocated to the US. So, even if the TSMC plants in Taiwan are destroyed, it's not going to affect the US industries and Apple and all that. Yeah, they will be able to keep manufacturing stuff there at a higher price, but that's fine. So Taiwan could, in a few years, become expendable. Taiwan obviously is a strategic asset for the US. It is one of the major choke points in the South China, so-called South China Sea, the Champa Sea. It is part of the first island chain. Let's put that on the screen so that you understand the geography. In case you don't know, I'm sure you do, but let's do it anyway. Here is Taiwan. Here is Taiwan. There you go. That is the island of Taiwan, and this is like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Uh, the US sells arms to Taiwan. The Taiwanese military is quite strong, and even today, the Chinese are not in a position to invade Taiwan possibly successfully because they would end up facing significant military setbacks. And obviously, the US supplies and uh, bolster the Taiwanese armed forces. And if the Chinese try to invade Taiwan, the Americans would get involved today. But in a few years, when Taiwan becomes expendable, what's going to happen if the Chinese try to invade? Will the US get involved? So, this move to start relocating the key assets of TSMC to the US and start opening TSMC plants in the US, it in a way reminds me of the 1985 Plaza Accord, which I have spoken about the Plaza Accord as well. You can search on this channel. The Plaza Accord in 1985 set in motion a process that led to the permanent decline of the Japanese economy. The Japanese economy is no longer what it used to be. In the 1980s, the Japanese economy was the second largest. It had become the second largest economy in the world. It was potentially going to surpass the US economy and become even larger than the US economy. And then you had the 1985 Plaza Accord, which slowly destroyed the Japanese economy. Yeah. So this move to start relocating and airlifting the core of the TSMC workforce to the US and start opening TSMC plants in the US could be similar to the Plaza Accord of 1985, which destroyed the Japanese economy. So we know that President Mr. Xi Jinping met with the US President Biden in Bali. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago. 15-16 November was the summit, the G20 summit in Bali. The two leaders met there. I am sure there is some kind of news report. Let us see. Yes, here is a Chinese news report. Let me put that on the screen. 1 second. Here it is. So this is the official Chinese government readout of the meeting. You know, their report of the meeting. President Xi Jinping meets with US President Joe Biden in Bali. So this meeting, I'm sure there is a US version of this as well and lots of other news reports. I'm just putting this on the screen as a reference. So the two leaders met for over 3 hours. And it is said that they sought to manage the differences between the two nations. Yeah. So I don't know. Obviously, Mr. Biden is no longer very capable of negotiating and all that, but I am sure they had very high ranking US officials there who negotiated with the Chinese. So what's going on behind the scenes? Like I have said many, many times, diplomacy and negotiations always happen in secret. They always happen behind the scenes. It's only when everything is finalized that something is announced to the public. So what are the two nations discussing and negotiating? The official statement from the US is that the two leaders sought to manage the differences between the two nations. So the question is this: is the United States preparing to eventually cede Taiwan to China? Maybe in a few years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. And is that something that was possibly discussed between the Americans and Xi Jinping's team? Because it's going to be very, very hard for the US to defend Taiwan in the long run. The US is a declining power. The Chinese, I know we all know that their economy is not doing well anymore. and they're facing significant problems, including the inexplicable COVID lockdowns and so on. But China is still a major economy, and they are investing a huge amount of money in building their naval muscle. The naval strength. They have been churning out warships like sausages. The Chinese. So in the long run, it's going to be extremely hard, almost impossible, for the US to defend Taiwan. Let's say in a 10-year or 20-year horizon, it's going to be almost impossible for the US to defend Taiwan. So Taiwan obviously is something that the two sides have discussed in the last meeting, 15, 16 November, in the meeting that is on the screen. So is the US negotiating with China about when it will be willing to allow China to take over Taiwan? It is a possibility. So before any such thing happens, the Americans will need to relocate all the core TSMC resources to the US, open multiple TSMC plants in the US. So if or when Taiwan is lost, the Americans will be able to continue to have business as usual, and they will not face any problems. So it looks like the Americans are preparing, not today, not next week, not next year, but in a few years, to reconcile themselves with the possibility that Taiwan will be taken over by China. And that is terrible. So who's going to suffer the most? It's going to be the Taiwanese people that suffer the most. The US used Taiwan all this time, and now it will soon become expendable, and they will let it go. And the Taiwanese people will have to deal with it. So that's how the world works. That's how the geopolitics works. There are no friends or enemies in geopolitics. It's all about your national interest. It's all about your self-interest. Everything is motivated by self-interest. So that's what's happening. That's this interesting emerging situation that we are witnessing vis-a-vis Taiwan and TSMC. It looks like in a few years the Americans will be fine with the Chinese taking over Taiwan. So let's see how that goes. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about something closer to home. Yes. Let's talk about Nepal. North of India, in the Himalayas, you have this wonderful nation called Nepal. So there's elections going on right now. Okay. So the incumbent prime minister, Mr. Sher Bahadur Deuba, his ruling coalition is currently in the lead. So this report is from 7 p.m. tonight, which is about 3 hours ago. So let's understand what's happening. See, the current elections in Nepal are for electing a new government and a new prime minister. The Nepalese parliament or House of Representatives has 275 members, 275 seats in the Nepalese parliament. Out of these 275 seats, 165 seats or members are elected through direct voting, and 110 seats or members are elected through a proportional electoral system, whatever that means. I don't know what it is, but that's how it goes. So 165 is through direct voting, and for a majority in the parliament, you need 138 seats. So if your political party or coalition has 138 seats, you have a majority, right? So Mr. Sher Bahadur Deuba is the current prime minister. He has been the prime minister since July 2021. He is the leader of the Nepali Congress. Yeah. And it's not, he's the leader of an entire coalition, which is led by his party, which is the Nepalese Congress. Other parties in this coalition are the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist Center, CPN Maoist Center, and the CPN Unified Socialist. Two communist parties that are members of his alliance. Mr. Sher Bahadur Deuba is perceived to be a moderate politician and a pro-India politician. And if you see this report, his coalition has won 77 seats thus far out of the 148 that have been declared. So his coalition is in the lead. The major opposition the opposition alliance is led by Mr. KP Sharma Oli. Yeah. His party is the CPN, Communist Party of Nepal, UML, CPN UML, and his allies or his alliance partners, other parties, are the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party and the Janata Samajwadi Party. So Mr. Oli, who is a former prime minister, he is strongly anti-India and strongly pro-China. His coalition has won how many seats thus far? He 48 seats, uh, 48 or so. So that's what's happening. So the pro-India alliance has won 77 or so seats, and the anti-India pro-China alliance has won 46 seats thus far. Now, Nepal of late, where is Nepal? I'm sure you all know where Nepal is, but let's put the map on the screen for reference purposes. Where is the map? Here's the map. So Nepal is over here, north of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, south of Tibet. That's where Nepal is. So Nepal has of late become extremely important from a geopolitical perspective. This nation has historically been part of the Indian subcontinent and part of Indian civilization. It is an integral and inalienable part of Indian civilization. The Nepalese people are the same as the Indian people, yeah, and that's why the Nepalese have the privilege of having the right to live in India, work in India as long as they want. They are treated almost like Indian citizens. The Nepalese can even serve in the Indian armed forces. That's how close the two nations are. The border is an open border, right? That's how it is. So Nepal has a privileged position vis-a-vis India, but it's become a very important geopolitical nation. I believe just this month, the Chinese Vice Minister for Culture and Tourism or something, Li Qin, visited Nepal. The Chinese have been wooing Nepal very strongly of late, especially when Mr. KP Sharma Oli was the Prime Minister. So in 2016, when Mr. Oli was the Prime Minister, he signed an agreement with China which gave Nepal access to Chinese sea and land ports, which gave Nepal an alternative to accessing trade routes via India. In 2017, Mr. Oli joined Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI project, right? So he made Nepal part of that project. In 2018, Mr. KP Sharma Oli visited China, and Xi Jinping uh, promised Italy about $500 million worth of aid to Nepal. And they signed lots of various agreements for infrastructure projects and all that. So the Chinese are extremely interested in Nepal uh, as a counterweight to India in a way. The Chinese, as we know, have been supporting Pakistan, and now the Pakistanis have gone into the US camp, and the Chinese have also been investing in relations with Nepal, with Bangladesh, and so on. Nepal is extremely important for them. Yeah. So, and Mr. Oli has been extremely pro-China. The other nation that you may be surprised that is interfering in this region or getting involved in this region is the USA, the United States. So, Nepal has signed up for something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, some kind of agreement. And Nepal is eligible for a $500 million American development grant. So Mr. Oli was against this. And Mr. Sher Bahadur Deuba, he made Nepal a part of this in I think February this year. He ratified the MCC agreement. Yeah. So Mr. Deuba is kind of trying to stay far from China and balance India and the US in some ways. There is also something called the State Partnership Program of the US, the SPP. Yeah. The objective of the so-called State Partnership Program is to minimize instability and encourage democratic governance in various nations. Yeah. So the SPP is guided by US State Department foreign policy goals. So this is just another way of furthering US geopolitical interests, and that's one of the things that the SPP does. The SPP does precisely that. So Sher Bahadur Deuba, he made Nepal a part of the MCC in February 2022, but he withdrew Nepal from the SPP in June 2022. So on the one hand, he made Nepal a part of the MCC, in which the Americans will invest about $500 million of money in Nepal for creating electrical infrastructure and various other projects which will advance American influence and interest in Nepal. Yeah. So that is something that Sher Bahadur Deuba is in favor of, and that's why he has ratified that. He has made Nepal part of the MCC thing, but he has withdrawn from the SPP, the State Partnership Program, which is aimed at having more geopolitical objectives. So he withdrew from that. So he is in favor of cooperating in terms of development in infrastructure, but not from a geopolitics perspective. So the SPP could also have a military angle, which could entail having some US military personnel on Nepalese territory, and that is something Sher Bahadur Deuba is against. Yes. So if you look at the overall policy and actions, not words but actions of Sher Bahadur Deuba, he has tried to distance Nepal from China. He is cooperating with the US when it comes to development in infrastructure, but he is distancing himself from the US and his country from the US when it comes to military activities and geopolitical activities. So Sher Bahadur Deuba is perceived to be pro India from the perspective of the actions he has taken, not the words he has spoken. Please, my dear Indian friends, you are all very enamored with words. Ignore words, look at actions. So, from the actions, we can say that Sher Bahadur Deuba is kind of a moderate leader, but he is more pro India, and definitely he's trying to distance his nation from China. So, right now, Sher Bahadur Deuba, his party, his political party is leading in the election, which is nice, and there's this other article on the uh, South China Morning Post. Did Nepal's China India Balancing Act cause it to ditch the US run SPP security initiative? The US Embassy in Nepal, this is an article from July this year, after Nepal withdrew from the uh, SPP security initiative. The US Embassy in Nepal was at pains to emphasize that the state partnership program is not and has never been a security or military alliance. Nepalese MPs were not convinced, and New Delhi likely shared Beijing's concerns about an increased US military presence in the region. The US, I don't think either India or China would want any kind of US military presence in Nepal. Yeah. So that's what the SPP is about. It's about having some kind of US military presence in Nepal, which obviously doesn't make any sense. The US has no business having a military presence in Nepal. So that is an interesting thing that's happened. And let's put something else here for context, for perspective. Yeah, this is what China has been doing. So this is an article from November 24, which is 2 days ago. China encroaches on 36 hectares of land along Nepal's northern border. Yes, China's salami slicing strategy on Nepal's northern border has resulted in the encroachment of 36 hectares of Nepal's land at 10 places. So that is what the Chinese have been doing. Take a look at the article. So on the one hand, they want to cooperate with Nepal. They want maybe to create a train route all the way to Nepal, and they want to give access to Nepal to Chinese ports and various other infrastructure. They want to sign agreements with Nepal and cooperate in a variety of ways, but they also want to steal Nepalese territory, which is the standard, good old time tested Chinese playbook. They will cooperate with their neighbors, but they will also encroach on their neighbors' territory to always keep them intimidated and off balance and always scared that we are larger than you, we can bully you, we can do whatever you want. You better cooperate with us. Otherwise, we will do more of this. This is the standard Chinese playbook, which is why I keep saying that India and no other country can ever trust China. We can collaborate with them in various ways, we can cooperate with them in various ways, but we can never ever trust the Chinese. Yeah. So if there are any Nepalese citizens watching this, please understand what's going on. India is not in Nepal's enemy. China is the real threat to Nepal. See what the Chinese did to Tibet, and then think about where you should where where the country has a friend and where it has an enemy. Yeah. So that's what's happening vis-a-vis Nepal, and that probably brings me to the end of today's thing. But let's take one more topic briefly. I'm sure you all know or may have heard of somebody called Kanye West, who is an American rapper, singer, and businessman and all that. So Kanye West has announced his candidacy for the 2024 US presidential election. And he went and met Donald Trump, and he requested Donald Trump to be his running mate, which means that Kanye will stand for president and he wants Donald Trump to be his vice president. So yeah, that's what happened. It's really funny. That's the kind of thing you have in the US, that entertainers can become, politicians and leaders. That's what we see in Ukraine as well. A comedian has become the leader of Ukraine. Obviously, he's been installed as a puppet, but that's how it goes. So that kind of makes you wonder what kind of democracy you have, because right now we have President Biden, who is clearly not in a position to run the country. He's not in the right mental state of mind. He's obviously he's in an advanced age, and obviously he is not in a position co- to cognitively to function cognitively at the level that you need to run a nation like the US. So I wonder who's really running the US. Obviously somebody is ruling the nation, running the nation, and it's obviously not Kamala Harris. So the US president doesn't really matter. It's somebody who should be entertaining, like Donald Trump was. He was entertaining. It should be either somebody who is very good at speaking, like Barack Obama was, and so on. So now entertainers are joining the fray. I think Kanye West ran in 2020 as well. So he has once again thrown his hat into the ring, and he wants to become the president of the US. And I wonder what his plan, what his campaign is going to be about, what his political position is going to be, what promises he will make. But let's see. So people in the US have been clamoring for various other entertainers to run for president. Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. Obviously, he was born in a different nation. That's why he's not eligible to be president of India, president of the US. Sorry. In India, a person who is born in a foreign country can become prime minister. In the US, if you are born in a foreign country, you cannot even run for president. That's how it is. So if that rule had not been there, Arnold Schwarzenegger would definitely have run for president. Yeah, but so that's something that could not happen. So people have been clamoring for someone like Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, to run for president, or Oprah Winfrey to run for president. So all it takes is that you should be popular, you should be able to speak well, and yeah, it helps if you're a woman or a minority, or if you're part of the LGBT, whatever that community is, so on. So that's the state of affairs in US politics. Uh, and yeah, so that's how it is. So Kanye West is running for president. Good for him, and I it will be interesting if he actually wins. It'll be at least entertaining for the world. And obviously, the US foreign policy will not change a bit, no matter who wins. So that's how it is, my dear friends. And that brings us to the end of today's Indian Interest episode. Thank you very much once again for your viewership and for your support. So, yeah. So once again, let me remind you that the course, it is currently available on a discount, only for 99 rupees. It's going to be available for that on that at a discounted rate until midnight Indian time. Maybe I'll keep it running for another few hours. That's how it is. So in case you wanted to buy it and you have not done it so far, please go ahead and do it. Otherwise, no problem. Everything on this channel will always be available for free, and I will never ever withdraw any information and put it as a course and not make it available here. That's never going to be the case. So that's how it is. And thank you very much for watching. And I will see you very soon in the next live stream, which is in less than 24 hours time. So I will see you then. Until then, take care and goodbye. Good night. Good day.